Hi, well, welcome to the Cotswolds Distillery online gin tasting. With me, Dan Szor. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Cotswolds Distillery and newborn gin convert. I was originally a bit of a whiskey geek, and that's really what got me to build this distillery back in 2014, was the idea of combining two great passions, which were single malt whiskey and the Cotswolds. You can tell from the accent, I'm not from around here. I grew up in New York City, spent 30 years in the world of finance, working in New York, Paris, and then London. My wife, who's British, and I bought a small farmhouse here to come up at the weekends, fell in love with the Cotswolds, and I was looking for what it was that I could do that made more of a difference in my life, something that I loved, something I was passionate about, and something that used the local products. And barley is growing all around us, and so whiskey certainly fit the bill. So we built the distillery in 2014 with the help of some wonderful mentors and a team of devoted young distillers. When it came to whiskey, we sort of really had everything we needed. We had 100 years of experience in Scottish whiskey making. But when it came to making all the other things that we wanted to make, we were really left to our own devices in terms of figuring out recipes and production processes. Gin was always something that we had wanted to make because we knew that whiskey would give us a very, very long wait until we had a spirit that we could offer our visitors here in the Cotswolds. So we'd always planned on making gin. We just had no idea that our gin would prove to be quite so popular and such a hit, and would spawn a whole range of gins. And tonight we're going to try, and I say only 5 of them because I think by now we probably have maybe nearly double that. This is all we could manage tonight, but this is a great representation of some of the different directions you can go with gin, and really the versatility of gin as a spirit. And something that, as I said, I've grown and we've all grown to be really passionate about. Before we go to our first gin, let me tell you a little bit about the distillery. We're in the North Cotswolds. We're about 6-7 miles away from Chipping Norton, not far from Stratford-on-Avon, about an hour and a half from London. We love having visitors here. We have about 100,000 visitors a year coming to see us here at the distillery and in 2 retail outlets we have in neighboring villages in the North Cotswolds. We run tours 3 a day, 7 days a week. And so as much as this is a fun way of us getting to you directly in the comfort of your home, we do hope one day you'll be able to come out and visit us. We have a great cafe and an outdoor terrace. The views are gorgeous. We're in the middle of the Cotswold countryside, and so we hope that you can come and see how we do it. But for those of you who can't do that in the near future, there is also a great virtual tour of our distillery that you can have a look at for free on our website. And it'll take you through our distillery, which is a couple feet from where I'm sitting right now in our new visitor center. And what we have there is 4 stills, 2 beautiful Scottish handmade whiskey pots, and 2 gleaming gin stills made in Germany by Holstein. They're hybrid stills, they're pot and column stills, and they allow us to make spirits in lots of different ways. The original one is named Lorelei and was our original gin still when we started in 2014. We had no idea our gin would prove so popular. And within 2 years, we found ourselves winning a lot of awards and running out of distilling capacity, so we had to go out and buy something a couple times the size of Lorelei, and that was Dolly, who is Lorelei's big sister at 12,500 liters to Lorelai's 1,200 liters, 1,250 liters to Lorelei's 500 liters, So we'll start with our flagship Cotswolds Dry Gin. which is the first gin that we made, that we released. We started making this in 2014, just a week or two after we began making our single malt whiskey. So I'm going to pour a little bit, and I hope you do too, so that as we talk about how we made this gin and how it's made, you can nose it. And the reason that's important is because I'm a big believer in nosing these gins. They are one of the great things about gin is its aromatic qualities. And the reason that I like alcohol in gin, among others, is because of the way in which it just lifts the botanicals to your nose. And you can see where this glass is right now, and I'm already getting it in a way that even with our whiskey I wouldn't get from a foot away. I'm just getting these incredible aromatic notes that are coming all the way up to me, and frankly, it's as enjoyable to sit around, having a conversation or with friends or watching the telly to nose it as it is to drink it. And even an empty glass will continue to have a wonderful aroma for hours after it's been emptied. So as I tell you about this, I will take advantage of it. So some of you may know that gin is essentially a flavored vodka. And vodka is really nothing other than a neutral spirit made from grain. Neutral grain spirit has to, by law, be extremely pure, over 96% pure. And so one of the first things to mention is that unlike our whiskey, we do not make the spirit for our gin. We buy the spirit. We buy the neutral grain spirit in for our gin. And the reason for that is simply that at 96%, there's very little that one can do to influence the flavor of the base spirit. There are differences, to be sure, between different neutral grain spirits, but they are minute. And by comparison to the difference in flavor of things that we can make through different macerations, different varieties of botanicals, or different whiskeys and different casks, it seemed to us that with a small team and limited budget, that the time and the effort to be making our own 96%, and by EU definition, odorless, colorless, and flavorless spirit didn't really seem to be worth it. So we start out with a base of a quite wonderful, quite pure, 100% wheat spirit, which is brought in. And then the science of gin is really this sort of the art of gin, I suppose, is really the art of how you then influence the flavor of that through distillation. And a London dry gin is by definition a gin where all of the flavor has been derived through the distillation. Nothing's been added to the gin by way of essences after it's been distilled. And so the first gin that we wanted to make as a distillery was a classic London dry style gin. What that typically will mean is that more than anything else, you have juniper as your leading botanical. So you can't really call it gin if you don't have a predominant juniper note. Gin, which was sort of invented in the, it's been said the 15th century in the Netherlands, was essentially a grain spirit which was flavored with juniper, really to mask the impurities that you had from early distillation. The quality of the underlying grain spirit improved greatly in the 19th century with the development of the column still or coffee still, and ever since then we've had the kind of gin that we now know as a sort of a London dry gin. So when we started our recipe development, we knew that we wanted a classic London dry gin, but we also wanted something that felt like it was from the Cotswolds and from the magic place that we're in. How do you put the Cotswolds into a spirit? Well, we had 3 distillers, and we had 2 months of time on our hands because they all came to work a couple months before our distillery was fully built. But we did have a great little research lab, and each of those distillers were given a very small still, about 1 liter, which could make a liter of spirit, and a list of 150 different botanicals to try and to see sort of where the flavor took them. And of course, the thing about distilling is that an ingredient that you distill, whether it's a seed, a leaf, or a root, will come across very differently once it's been distilled as it will as a raw ingredient. So you really don't know what it can give to a gin until you've tried it. So over the course of about a month, our team of young distillers went through that list of 150 botanicals and created a botanical library of 150 single ingredient distillates. And we tried just about everything. We still have that library to this date. It's in our now new and bigger R&D lab. We tried everything from the sort of obvious choices that you'd find in gins, like coriander, cassia, and such, to horseradish, to fresh fruit, anything we could think of, really. We had about 60 prototype recipes that followed that initial 150 distillations, and most of our recipes, most recipes for gin would typically contain anywhere between a handful and maybe a dozen and a half different botanicals. More than that, and I know there are a lot of gins that do have more botanicals than that, and it's really difficult to differentiate them or to pick them apart. The nose and the palate really can't detect them. Anyway, of the 60 gins that we made and we tasted through sort of on a weekly basis, we came up with a short list of 12 semi-finalists and then a list of three finalists, which we tasted against a number of well-known major gins before we decided on the winning recipe. And all of our gins have this one thing in common is that they have a relatively high ABV. They're 46% ABV. By law, gin has to be at least 37.5 ABV. Ours have always been 46. And why 46? We'll get into that in a little bit, but it has to do with the minimum alcohol level that you're typically advised to use if you don't filter the botanical oils out of your gin, because otherwise you can develop a haze in the bottle. So the winning combination basically was what became our Cotswolds Dry Gin, which was launched in October of 2014. And it is a really unique gin. And I'll explain why. I built this distillery out of a love of flavor and spirits, and typically big flavors. So all of our whiskeys are quite rich and full of flavor, and we wanted all of our spirits to similarly be packed full of flavor. And one of our distillers really took me at my word when I said I wanted the most aromatic, the richest possible gin. And he came up with a recipe which involves using 10 times the amount of botanicals by weight as one would typically use to make a premium gin. The recipe itself is relatively simple. It involves what we call the holy trinity of gin, which is juniper, coriander, and angelica as the base botanicals. Coriander, you get some lovely sort of lemony notes, even though it's a seed. The juniper, of course, those great piney, resinous notes. And what we typically think of in a gin is trying to hit all of the major flavor blocks. So we're really looking, obviously, for the juniper, but then we're looking for floral notes, fruit notes, herbal notes, spice notes. And we're trying to get the balance between all of those so that no one flavor group sort of predominates. In our initial research, one of the things that we found is that when looking for the fruit or citrus, typically in a gin notes, by using fresh fruit, we would get a lot more flavors, because by using fresh fruit versus dried peel, which is what most distillers, most gin makers use, you get a lot more oil from the fruit. You get these essential oils, these botanical extracts, which really give you full flavor. In fact, we found out about that through one of our distillers deciding to distill his lunch, which was his girlfriend had packed him an orange for dessert, and he used the skins and he distilled them, and we found that the orange flavor was much more intense than what you would get with dried orange peel. With our Cotswolds dry gin, the two fruits that we use are pink grapefruit and lime. And so from the start and to this day, we hand peel all of our fruit. And it's come to crazy proportions in that we now peel. We use something on the order of 500 grapefruits and 800 limes a week, and all of that is fresh peeled. And if you ever come to the distillery and come into our bottling hall in a day when they're peeling away, the aromas are absolutely unbelievable, and they result in a lot of balled fruit, which gets brought over to our cafe where we can make grapefruit collins and lime juice and all sorts of good things. But so you get a real intense citrus flavor in this gin, and on the nose. And that's nicely balanced with a little bit of black pepper, which gives you just a hint of spiciness. And you don't need a lot of black pepper. A little bit goes a long way. A couple of grains, really, even in a 1,200 liter batch will suffice. There's then a great sort of herbal note that comes primarily from bay leaf. You get sort of this cool menthol eucalyptus kind of note from the bay leaf. And then a florality from cardamom, and then most importantly from Cotswold lavender, which is our sort of signature ingredient. And why signature? Because we thought that what sort of represents the flowers of the Cotswolds, the Cotswold Gardens, there's so many famous ones nearby, more than lavender. And it so happens that there's a wonderful lavender farm very close to the distillery in the town of Snows Hill, which is just above Broadway. A local farmer who was mainly farming cereals decided to change over and farm lavender on the high wold at a couple hundred meters. It's a bit crazy, but an incredible place to go, particularly in July when they're just about to harvest the lavender. You'd think you're in the south of France. And one of the varieties of lavender that he uses is culinary lavender, which you can cook with or distill with. Lavender is a tricky one. You want to use a little bit, not too much. You don't want to go over the top on the lavender. But again, I think the magic of this gin is just the balance that's achieved with those 9 botanicals in the right preponderance and the right balance, but just a lot of everything. So let's have a taste. It's delicious. It's as a whiskey buff. I'm used to drinking spirits on their own straight, and I kind of prefer them straight, even room temperature, which is not to say that this doesn't make a great cocktail. It does. It makes the best G&T you will ever have, quite seriously. But right now we're trying them on their own just because that allows us to really appreciate the aromas and the viscosity of this. It's sort of a thick and creamy gin. We always bring a sneaky bottle of this gin to whiskey shows with us, and we let die-hard whiskey drinkers who never drink gin, but whose palates are exhausted after trying a dozen or two whiskeys, have a sniff and have a taste, and they just fall in love with it. And why is that? Well, I always say that this is sort of gin made by a whiskey lover and a flavor lover, and it's very different than a typical gin. It really is made with love and 10 times the normal amount of ingredients. So it's just packed full of flavor. So another interesting feature of this gin that we found out about before we went into production with it is that because of the 10 times the sort of regular amount of botanicals that would normally go into it, there's 10 times the amount of suspended oils in the alcohol. That's why there's so much flavor in this gin. Really, when you think about what gin is, you're basically drinking something which is alcohol, water, and oils, botanical extracts. And alcohol has no flavor, and water has no flavor. So really, all the flavor is coming from those botanical extracts. And with 10 times the amount, what will happen is that if the level of the alcohol goes below sort of the 46% at which we bottle it, some of those oils will start to actually come out of solution. They'll no longer be suspended, and the liquid will no longer be clear. It will start to cloud. It will become pearlescent, just ever so slightly cloudy. And that's something that whiskey drinkers are quite familiar with, particularly drinkers of kind of premium single malt whiskeys, which proudly advertise the fact that they are non-chill filtered. What chill filtration does is it brings the temperature of an alcohol down, of a spirit, down to where the oils start to coalesce, and then it sieves them out so that the alcohol can be more clear and look prettier sort of on the shelf, brighter, etc. And whiskey drinkers tend to prefer their whiskey non-chill filtered, more full flavored, even if it goes a little bit of cloudy when you add water. And when we saw the fact that our gin clouded up, we said to ourselves, you know what, we'll leave it that way, simply because for us what's more important than anything else is the flavor. And this slight pearlescence tells the story of the flavor and the fact that we're putting so much more in than most people, and you're hopefully getting so much more out as a drinker. And that cost us a couple of awards in our early years, because the traditionalists who judge many of the spirits competitions felt that ought to be, that would be considered the sign of a faulty distillation, that our cuts, when we make our distilling cuts between the head cut, the beginning of the distilling run, the heart cut, which is the bit that's kept for gin, and the tails, the lower and less desirable alcohols, that those cuts weren't right and that we were taking too big a hard cut. As a matter of fact, we take one of the smallest hard cuts in the business. But despite the small hard cut we take, the fact that we're just pumping so much more in the way of botanicals in creates this signature cloudiness. So we're quite happy about that. And I go on about that quite a bit, because I suppose it was sort of brave of us in the beginning, because most people don't expect a gin that isn't clear. But nowadays we think people care more about the amount of flavor in their drink than the amount of alcohol in their drink. So that's our take on that. So what can you do with this gin? Well, as I said, it makes a tremendous G&T, or cloudy G&T as we call it. So typically we'd suggest 50 ml of Cotswolds dry gin with 200 ml of the amount of your favorite tonic that you prefer. I would typically use between 150 and 200 ml of a premium tonic, a Fever Tree or other. And the garnish we always suggest is a slice of pink grapefruit and a fresh bay leaf if you can find it. And that's more for the look than for the taste, because there's so much in here already. You don't need anything from the garnish except just to please your eyes. But it also works extremely well in the classic gin cocktails. There's sort of the holy trinity of gin cocktails I always think of as being the G&T, the martini, and the Negroni. It makes a tremendous martini. A cloudy martini, but a great martini, and one that is packed full of flavor. And it marries extremely well because of that fruitiness with vermouth. And so it makes a great Negroni. I'd highly recommend it, particularly with our Cotswold vermouth. Again, Cotswold's dry gin. We hope you enjoy it. And one last sip. That's wonderful. So up next is our second gin of the tasting, our Cotswolds Old Tom. Before I pour this, or maybe actually while I pour it, I'll tell you the story behind this. And because we're a small distillery and we're really all about our people, there are a lot of stories behind our spirits. Each one is unique, and I think particularly where gin is concerned, it's very much about our own in-house R&D and the creativity of a bunch of research and development sort of R&D distillers, many of them with very little previous experience, but just great palates and real drive, determination, and passion for experimenting with gin, which isn't, I suppose, the worst job you could have, and coming up with some really incredible gins as a result. And a perfect case in point is our Old Tom. Now, Old Tom was not our second gin that we did. It was actually, I think maybe our fourth or fifth, but it's in this lineup in second position because it's one of the best known types of gin after London Dry. And the main difference between a London Dry gin and an Old Tom is in the sweetness. So the dry in London Dry means that it's not a sweetened gin. It's not been sweetened with sugar. And sugar and alcohol have traditionally gone quite well together. In fact, that's really the basis of liqueurs. To be able to call it a liqueur, you have to have a certain sugar content. And you can even go beyond that and call it a cream, like a crème de pêche or crème de menthe. And in the old days, when the quality of distilled spirits was pretty low, sugar was used as a means of kind of hiding some of the faults and the off notes and the imperfections in distilled spirits. And that's how Old Tom sort of came about. It's a gin style that I think was probably best known as having come into existence sort of late 19th, early 20th century. And there are various stories about why it's called Old Tom, which go from signs of cats above speakeasy doors to folks named Tom. But that's really kind of irrelevant for the purpose of our discussion here. What's really relevant is Alice. So Alice is our head of NPD, New Product Development. And when Alice joined us, she was 19 years old. And she actually started before working in our lab, in our visitor center, doing tours, leading people around and helping visitors out. And then when there was an opening in our lab, she came in and she was an assistant R&D distiller. And at that point, our project was to develop an Old Tom gin. And what we typically will do is we'll have multiple distillers develop multiple recipes. And so we'll have an awful lot of candidates, and we'll lay them all out in our blending room and have the whole company file through, have a taste, fill out forms in terms of their sensory appraisal as to which one they like the best. And after the dust settled on our Old Tom tasting, the winner by a mile was Alice's Old Tom gin. So so our own Alice, who was only a year into being allowed to drink and probably had never had an Old Tom before, was able to develop this great formulation, and which speaks to what is for me the difference really between gin and whiskey, because with whiskey, you're going through a process which is very much the same for all the whiskey that you're making, and the difference really comes from cask type and age, where it's been matured, how long it's been matured, etc. Whereas with gin, it's much more sort of, it's very similar to cooking. You can give a dozen people the same bunch of ingredients and they'll all put them together in different ways. And it's all about balance, and it's all about having a good palate. And Alice has an amazing palate. And even at her tender young age, she just put together flavors in a way which was really a hit. What's in our Old Tom gin? Well, there's the gin base, the juniper, coriander, angelica. And there is the sweetness, which Alice came about in an interesting way. The sweetness came from licorice root, which was not what you'd typically get just from adding sort of cane sugar, or sugar syrup. There's also some really nice, light, lifted notes of ginger spice, a little bit of florality from cardamom as well. And for the fruit note, rather than the sort of pink grapefruit and lime that is really the signature of our Cotswolds Dry Gin, there was a light orange zest note. So it's a wonderful drink, and you get that sort of freshness. You certainly pick up a bit of cardamom on the nose, and then let's give it a try here. The sweetness is wonderful. It's refreshing, but it's not overpowering. There's nothing I personally like less than something that is just way too syrupy and too sort of thick in your mouth. What do you do with Old Tom gin? Well, you'll probably hear the same thing from me about all of our gins, which is they're pretty wonderful, drunk just like this, on their own, no ice needed, if you like spirits, if you really like pure spirits. But obviously being gins, they lend themselves extremely well to cocktails. I would say the next place I would go after, first of all, having tried this on its own, is to just a simple pour on the rocks. And they can certainly be really successfully married with any of the fizzy mixers, with tonics, with soda, etc. Of course, one of the well-known uses of an Old Tom gin is in the Tom Collins. So that would be sort of very much on the lemon side of things, lemonade but probably my favorite cocktail in which Old Tom is the traditional ingredient, is the Martinez, which was actually the precursor of the martini. And it's a drink which typically where you would involve vermouth, sweet vermouth, and a little bit of maraschino liqueur, and those ingredients just marry together really well. And try a Martinez with our Cotswolds Old Tom. Cheers. So next up is our Cotswolds Wildflower gin. So the inspiration for this gin came from the beautiful wildflowers that grow up and down the Cotswolds and the sort of Jurassic grasslands that used to be the whole Cotswolds. And what we wanted to do was to create something that would make a beautiful long drink, a spritz, if you will. And we did that by layering some beautiful sort of wildflower-inspired essences. So we've got lavender, we have bitter orange, we have cornflower, beautiful wildflower that grows in the Cotswolds, all layered on top of a classic London dry gin. So juniper, coriander, angelica, full strength, so it's 40%. Beautiful sort of red color, which works really well in an aperitif. And we'll try some neat here. This is just a beautiful sort of fresh orange blossom, lavender, just a real coolness and a freshness. But the way it's best served, taking a cup of glass, putting 50 ml over ice, and then adding your favorite tonic water. Give it a little stir. And here you have a Cotswolds Wildflower spritz. Delicious, refreshing long drink. Cheers. So next up is our beautiful 1616 gin. So this was released in April 2016, 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. Lived just down the road from us in Stratford. And it was the second gin we'd ever made. And we wanted to do something as different as possible from our original Cotswolds dry gin. And this is quite different in that it is a Genever, technically. Genever is the precursor to gin, made in the Netherlands in the 15th century. Genever being the Dutch word for juniper. And the Dutch were the first people to come up with the idea of adding juniper to a malt distillate. And since we make a lot of malt distillate here at the Cotswolds Distillery for our whiskey, we thought it'd be great to redistill that a third time using sort of gin-friendly botanicals and botanicals of the period at which you might have had a Genever back in the 15th century. So what we've done is we've used quite a bit of juniper, coriander, angelica, but then we've swapped out the sort of grapefruit and lime from our Cotswolds dry gin for orange, which is a wonderful addition, wonderful botanical, works very well with whiskey spirit. And then we've used sort of things that you might have found, trade root sort of botanicals, like cassia, nutmeg, allspice, all of which work really well with our whiskey new make spirit. It's been distilled for the third time in our gin still, and then it's been aged for a number of months in our beautiful ex-red wine casks, which give it a wonderful golden color. So let's give it a try. And on the nose, you get the orange right away and the spiciness. And you still get quite a hit of juniper. You get that nice sort of piney resinous quality which works really well with the tannins that come out of the wood. Let's give it a try. So it's lovely in that it's not completely a gin, it's not completely a whiskey, and it has something in it for everyone. And we find that our whiskey lovers really can relate to this, as can our gin lovers. It's terrific on its own, just like this, as a sort of a sipper. It's great on the rocks. One of the ways we love to serve it here at the distillery is in what we call a Shakespeare mule. And what we do is we'll add this to ginger beer, a little bit of triple sec or Cointreau, maybe a squeeze of fresh lime, and put it in a copper mule mug with a lot of ice, shaved ice if you can. Terrifically refreshing on a summer's day, and 1616, I hope you enjoy it. So we come to our last gin of the tasting, which is our Cotswolds Hedgerow gin. So this is our take on a slow gin. It's a traditional form of gin. It's something we've always wanted to do, and how could you not want to do something like that when you've got a hedge of sloes growing right out back? And we do. We're in between two hedgerows here. One of them goes the length of the back of the distillery and the visitor center, and it's got virtually everything that's in this gin growing on it. Sloes, blackberries, bramble, etc. So it always felt to us as though this should be something we should do amongst our offerings. What mostly is done is typically for slow gin is to take a slow extract, a slow juice. I didn't really know about that in the beginning. I made sloe at home. And I collected sloes. At home we have a sloe tree, and I froze them or pricked them, put them in gin with sugar, and put them in a cupboard in a Kilmer jar sort of for a couple of months. And I thought that's the way you do it at a distillery as well. Only to make the kind of quantities that we do, we had to find somebody who could provide us serious amounts of hedgerow fruit and sloe. And that was really hard to do. And then we finally, after a long search, came upon a guy, and his name is Vince. And he's in Oxfordshire, and he is a picker. And he marshals every year a squad of pickers to go out and pick the hedgerows and pick all the local fruit. And so Vince had promised me the quantity of sloes that I wanted, which I think at the start was a few hundred kilos. But then told me he could get more than just sloes for us, and that in fact he might fall short on the sloes, but he could make it up in bullace. At the time I didn't know what bullace was. I now know that bullace is also known as king sloe. It's basically just a larger variant of the sloe berry. Vince also picked damson and blackberries. So the idea came to us to not limit ourselves to just sloe, but to make a gin that was a blend of everything that grew nearby, and call it Hedgerow gin. So this is a gin which differs every year according to what's available. So it's a combination of sloe, damson, bullace, and bramble. Those are the four fruits. And just as you would at home, crazily, they are macerated in giant tanks. They're delivered to us typically in September and October when they're picked. It's a little bit different every year. And they're immediately put into a tank and covered with our Cotswolds dry gin and sweetened lightly. This is after they've been frozen, which helps to open them up when they then thaw out. And they stay there in our gin for pretty much a year until we're ready to empty the tanks in preparation for the next year's delivery. So that's a very, very long maceration time, and there's some really, really boozy fruit that comes out when we empty those tanks, and it sort of looks like a horror film. The day that we empty those tanks, you have a lot of people running around in red-stained lab coats, and it's pretty crazy. It gets very sticky. But what the result of that is something which really just brings the fruit out to you full strength, full force, and which just has this lovely. We also, by the way, this is 37.5 ABV. Everything we do is about doing it sort of to another degree, and most slows are typically in the sort of mid to high 20s. We feel again that you need a little bit of a higher alcohol content to just boost the aromatics and boost the flavor. But it's tremendous, and one of the things that I love is actually if you are able to stay away from it for a while and just leave it. Over time, it starts to oxidize and the colors start to change. I don't know if you can see this, but it turns the most lovely sort of shade of brown, kind of, you get that russet, that sort of red-brown color, which looks like an old burgundy sort of. So a great color and one really to appreciate both, in your eyes and on your nose before even trying it. It does have a great aroma. And let's give it a try. It's soft, it's smooth, it's not overly sweetened. We always try and really limit the sweetening. We've always liked things to be just a little bit less sweet than you might normally, just not too cloying. I can't be much more original than what I've already said in that I like it just the way it is, just sipped neat. It is great on the rocks. And seasonally, one of the things that I find year-end is just wonderful about it is when you serve it with fizz, right? I mean, it's just great with champagne or prosecco, and it will also make a great sort of a bramble cocktail if you replace the sort of traditional ingredients with the sloe. But on its own or in a cocktail, it's a real treat. Or in a flask if you're going out for a walk, which if you come and visit us, we hope you will. So cheers. So that's the last gin. And we hope you've enjoyed the tasting. But to really experience Cotswolds Distillery, you need to come and see us and visit us and see where we are and experience this beautiful part of the country. And so we hope you'll be able at some point to come and pay us a visit. We're open 7 days a week. We've got tours running every day, blend your own whiskey and make your own gin classes, a great cafe, entertainment. So please come and pay us a visit. Enjoy our gins in the meantime. And thanks for being with me for this past hour. Cheers.